Walt read the score from downrange, his voice carrying flat across the October silence. 60 out of 60. Perfect score. And the number landed in the crowd the way a stone lands in still water, and in the moment before the noise started, Clint Eastwood set his revolver down on the bench beside him without being aware that he'd done it. Notice, because Clint had driven to that range on a Saturday morning, certain of what he was going to find, and what he'd said at the Formosa Cafe 2 weeks earlier in front of 6 witnesses had made the afternoon feel like a settled thing, and the cost of being wrong about it was not going to be small. And in the next 60 seconds he was going to have to decide, in front of 30 people, what kind of man he actually was. Dean Martin had been a member of the Chatsworth Valley Shooting Club for 8 months. He came on Saturdays now. He'd moved from Thursdays when the fall schedule pushed more traffic onto the range, and he came alone. He signed the log at the front desk with Pete, walked out to position 4, and practiced. No one here needed anything from him. No warmth performed, no punchline required, no particular version of Dean Martin expected or tolerated. He was a man with a revolver and a target at 50 yards, and the quiet that he had found, with real surprise, was available to him in almost no other context. He had come to that specific Saturday with a reason. The reason had a name: Roy Harlan. Harlan had been the 1958 California State Pistol Champion. Not a Hollywood hire, not an armorer who did picture work on the side. A working competitive shooter who had turned down 3 other productions in the same season because their budgets wouldn't pay for real instruction. Howard Hawks had brought him onto Rio Bravo in pre-production, and Harlan had spent 3 weeks in Tucson teaching Dean Martin the mechanics of accurate pistol shooting the way Harlan understood them, from the ground up, no shortcuts, no camera-ready approximations. By the end of the 3rd week, Harlan had told Hawks privately that he had not seen anyone absorb these mechanics with that combination of speed and seriousness in 30 years of teaching. Dean had the bruised wrist from the early sessions. He had the callus on his trigger finger. After the film wrapped, he had kept going back to Harlan's range in Burbank on Tuesday evenings, not because any future production required it, but because the practice gave him something real in a professional life that was mostly performance. And then, 8 months ago, position 4 at Chatsworth. Every Saturday, the $12 factory revolver from a hardware store in Tucson, the same one he'd carried since Arizona. 2 weeks earlier, someone in the Ocean's 11 wardrobe department had mentioned in the sideways manner that people in this industry use to convey things they believe you should know, that a young actor on the Rawhide set had been holding court at the Formosa. The young actor's name was Clint Eastwood. What he'd been saying, loudly with the easy authority of a man who had not yet measured the distance between what he believed and what he knew, was that Dean Martin's gun work in Rio Bravo was smoke and mirrors, that Howard Hawks had pointed a Vegas entertainer at the camera and let the armorers handle the actual craft, that Dean Martin had gotten lucky with a Western the way some people get lucky with things that don't belong to them. 6 witnesses, the Formosa, on a Thursday, after the Rawhide shoot wrap. Dean had listened to this with the level expression he gave most information. He had thanked the woman. He had gone home. But here was the thing that had been sitting in him for 2 weeks. Sitting the way most things didn't sit. Rio Bravo had been real work. The 3 weeks in Arizona heat with Harlan, the Burbank Tuesdays, the 8 months at position 4. That had produced something genuine, and the only test of whether it was genuine was whether it held under conditions that had nothing to do with movies or impressions or what anyone at the Formosa believed. He had not come to Chatsworth to impress anybody. He had come because some work deserves to be tested. Some things a man needs to confirm to himself before they are fully his. That was loop 1, and notice how quietly it was framed. Not whether Dean Martin could prove himself to someone else, but whether the work could stand on its own terms, on a range where nobody owed him anything. The answer was going to come in a way Dean didn't entirely plan for. He was 2 sets into his practice when the truck pulled into the gravel lot. Pete had mentioned it when Dean signed the log that morning. The Rawhide location crew had been on the far range since 7. Dean had taken his card back and said nothing. He heard the voices before he saw them. 3 men walking from the direction of the far positions, the easy walk of people who have been shooting all morning and have spotted something worth their attention. Clint Eastwood was 30 years old. Rawhide was number 6 in the national ratings. He was 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, locked into a CBS contract that had blocked every feature film offer in 3 years. He was talented and restless, and those 2 things in combination had been producing a version of certainty that outran the facts supporting it. The 2 men with him were a camera operator named Sal, who laughed at most things, and a location manager named Dutch, who had been making westerns for 15 years and treated that fact as a weapon. They stopped a few feet from position 4. Dean heard them. He finished his set. 4 more rounds, same spacing, same stillness. Lowered the revolver and turned. Clint looked at the revolver in Dean's hand, then at the target downrange, then back at Dean. "Well," he said. "Dean Martin." Dean said nothing. Sal chuckled. "Don't tell me the Rat Pack shoots." "I do," Dean said. Dutch crossed his arms. "At a real range? Or is this for a magazine?" A few members had started drifting over from adjacent positions. 4, 5 people. Enough that the quality of the moment shifted from private to observed. Dean turned back to his revolver and opened the cylinder. "We've heard about Rio Bravo," Clint said. "The gun work. People have been talking about how it looked." Dean pressed 6 rounds into the cylinder without looking up. Sal picked up the thread. "We also heard Hawks had 3 armorers doing the real work. That the close-up stuff was just you pointing in the right direction while somebody else handled the craft." Dean closed the cylinder. He looked up at Clint. Clint met his eyes. "I said it," he said, without any particular emphasis. "The Formosa, 2 weeks ago. It got back to you. What I said was that a singer doing a western doesn't make him a shooter. That Rio Bravo looked good on camera because Hawks is a smart director, not because you can actually shoot." Notice the crowd here, because it had reached 15 people without anyone appearing to move toward it. That is what happens when 2 known faces face each other at a range on a Saturday morning and neither one of them is backing down. People don't walk toward it. They simply stop walking away. A woman's voice came from near the scoring table. For the love of, she was in her 50s. Silver-haired, competition shooting vest. 6 patch emblems on it. Her name was Carol Briggs, and she had won the women's open division at this club 3 times in 4 years. And she was looking at the scene in front of her with the expression of someone who has seen this particular setup before and found it no more interesting with repetition. She said to Clint, "You walked from the far range to stand at this man's position and tell him, in front of everybody, that the thing you just watched him do for 20 minutes isn't real." Clint looked at her. "Ma'am, don't," Carol said. She turned to Walt, the range master, who had been walking over from the clubhouse with his clipboard and had now arrived. Walt was in his 60s, gray mustache, the weathered patience of someone who had run a club for 35 years and had learned to read the shape of a situation from 50 yards. "Are we settling this properly, or are we going to stand here all morning?" Walt looked at Dean. Dean looked at Clint. Here is what was actually happening in that moment, and it is easy to miss. Dean Martin did not accept what followed because he needed to prove himself to Clint Eastwood. He accepted it because the work deserved a real test, because Harlan and the Burbank Tuesdays and 8 months at position 4 deserved to be measured against something that mattered, under conditions that didn't care about the result. Clint had walked up and handed him that test. Dean was not the kind of man who turned down a real test. And that was the second open question. The one that had been sitting in him since the Formosa comment landed. Not whether Clint Eastwood would be proven wrong, but whether the work itself would hold under conditions that had no interest in the answer. Harlan and the Burbank Tuesdays and 8 months at position 4. Would it be there when it needed to be there? "All right," Dean said. "Let's settle it. Listen, because what happened next is easy to summarize as a match between 2 men. And that summary misses everything important about it." Clint said, "Standard precision. Walt picks the distance. Dean looked downrange at the stakes in the open ground. 50 yards, he said. The crowd went quiet. Sal looked at Dutch. Dutch looked at Walt. Even Carol Briggs stopped moving for a moment. Walt said, 50 yards with a revolver is a serious proposition. Yes, Dean said. Clint studied him. 30 years old, good with a gun. 3 years of serious practice behind him. The internal arithmetic was visible on his face. Then, fine, 50 yards. Walt pulled out his pencil. He said, coin toss for order. 6 rounds each, fresh targets. Both scores posted for the room to see. The countdown had started, and every person watching understood it. 6 shots each, 1 score against another. Dean's turn still to come. Walt called heads. Clint called it in the air. Walt looked at it on the ground and said, Mr. Eastwood, you shoot first. Walt walked downrange to set fresh targets at 50 yards. While he walked, the crowd filled in. 30 people by the time he returned. Maybe more. Members from the far range, staff from the clubhouse. 2 families who had come for a junior clinic that morning and had quietly decided this was more instructive. Dutch had found an angle near the bench. Sal was making commentary to no one in particular. Carol Briggs had moved to the back of the crowd with her arms folded and her expression completely neutral. Money was changing hands. The odds were 2-1 on Eastwood. This was not unreasonable. The 30 people who had been watching Clint shoot all morning had seen something real, and the 2-1 line reflected real information. They simply did not have all of it. 6 shots from Clint, then 6 from Dean. The whole morning had been converging on those 12 rounds since the moment Clint walked over from the far range. And now there was nothing between here and the answer except Walt's coin toss. Walt returned and called both men to the line. Clint opened his case. The Colt single-action Army inside had custom grips fitted to his hand by a gunsmith in Burbank. Championship hardware, properly maintained. He loaded it with the methodical care of a man who has done this hundreds of times and still does not rush it. He had been putting in real hours at real ranges for 3 years, and his body knew it. He walked to the firing line. The crowd went dead. This was championship-level pressure. 30 people, money down. The whole morning converging on 6 shots at 50 yards. And Clint Eastwood, whatever else he was not a man who folded under pressure. He took his stance, wide, stable, extended arm. The position of someone who has had formal instruction and absorbed it properly. He raised the Colt, took a breath, let it halfway out. The first shot cracked into the October air. He didn't wait to see where it landed. He adjusted by feel and fired again. 6 shots in 30 seconds, each placed with the attention of a man who knows what real practice produces and has done the practice. When he stepped back from the line, his arm was steady. His expression was neutral. His eyes went immediately to the target at 50 yards. Walt walked downrange. The crowd tracked him in silence all the way to the target. Walt examined it for a moment. Then he turned. 5 shots in the bullseye. 1 on the outer ring, 7-inch grouping. Score, 54 out of 60. The crowd broke open. 54 out of 60 at 50 yards with a revolver. That was exceptional shooting, the kind of number that wins competitions, and 30 people who had been watching Clint all morning reacted with the satisfaction of people whose judgment has been confirmed. Dutch put a hand on Clint's shoulder. Sal was immediately and entirely enthusiastic. Clint accepted it with a nod. His eyes were on Dean. "Your turn," he said. The third question, the one nobody had asked aloud, because the first 2 were already enough, was this: whatever happened on the target at 50 yards, whatever the number turned out to be, what was Clint Eastwood going to do with it? Stop for a second and picture the bench at this moment, because what you are about to see only makes sense when you understand what is sitting on it. Dean's revolver, a standard production model purchased for $12 from a hardware store in Tucson during the Rio Bravo shoot. Nothing custom, no fitted grips, no gunsmith work, no competition hardware. Roy Harlan had said once that the revolver a man shoots best is almost never the most expensive one. It is the one he has put the most honest hours into. That $12 revolver had more honest hours on it than most competition pieces ever see. Dean walked to the firing line. What Clint saw, and what every person in that crowd saw, though most couldn't have said precisely what they were seeing, a quality of stillness in Dean's body that was different in kind from composed concentration. It was not a man settling himself for the shot. It was a man who had already arrived. The difference is real. Anyone who has watched enough serious shooting knows it. Dean raised his arm. The stance was not a competition stance. Not the wide-footed extended arm position that Clint had used. It was what Harlan had drilled into him in Arizona heat. Weight slightly forward, arm extended but not locked. The revolver placed into the hand the way Harlan described it, not gripped, placed, as if the hand were simply confirming a decision the revolver had already made. The first shot arrived, and the second followed, before the echo of the first had dissolved into the hills. Then the third and the fourth and the fifth and sixth in the same even, unhurried sequence. No drama in the spacing, no performance. The weight of the $12 revolver was the same weight it had always been. Familiar in the hand, the way something is familiar when you have held it in the dark and in the heat and in the cold, and it has always weighed the same. 6 shots and then stillness, and Dean lowered his arm, and his breathing had not changed. The crowd was so quiet that people could hear Walt's footsteps on the packed dirt at 50 yards. Walt reached the target. He looked at it. He stood there for a moment that ran well past the time needed for any reasonable examination. Then he turned around, and his face, the professionally neutral face of a man who had been running a range since 1925, had on it an expression that was not neutral at all. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 shots, all 6 in the bullseye. 3-inch grouping. Score 60 out of 60. Perfect score. The range exploded. Some people cheered. Some made sounds that were not quite words. Carol Briggs said nothing. She looked at Clint Eastwood with an expression that required no translation. Sal went completely quiet, which was the most significant thing Sal had done all morning. Dutch was looking at the target in Walt's hands with the focused attention of a man running arithmetic that will not come out the way he expected no matter how many times he runs it. That's not possible, Sal said. Nobody shoots perfect at 50 yards. Somebody just did, Carol said. Remember the smell of the range at that moment. Gun smoke thin in the October air, the dry grass scent of the hills behind the targets, and 30 people standing absolutely still while Walt walked back with both targets in his hands. That is the frame around everything that followed. Walt brought both targets back and set them side by side on the bench. Clint's, 5 in the bullseye, 1 on the ring, 7-inch spread. Dean's, 6 holes clustered in the center, 2 of them nearly overlapping, a 3-inch grouping that looked less like a shot pattern and more like a single decision made 6 times in the same location. Clint picked up Dean's target. He held it in the October light. Before we go further, you need to understand one thing about what Clint Eastwood was dealing with at this bench. He was 30 years old. He was good, genuinely good, and the 54 he had just put on the board was real, and he knew it. What he was looking at on Dean's target was not something he could argue with or reframe or attribute to luck and keep his self-respect. 3 inches at 50 yards with a factory revolver. He was holding the arithmetic of it in his hands, and the arithmetic did not care how he felt about it. He set the target down. He looked at Dean. Where did that come from? Not humble. Not performed. The voice of a man who has decided that the true answer matters more than the comfortable one. Rio Bravo, Dean said. A man named Roy Harlan. Clint was still. Harlan. The state champion. That's right. After the picture, his range in Burbank. Tuesdays. Then here since February, a new voice joined from the edge of the crowd before Clint could respond. Well, I'll be damned. An older man was walking from the direction of the clubhouse. Late 60s, straight-backed, unhurried, a plain jacket with a small pin on the lapel. His name was George Aldrich. For 11 years before his retirement, he had run the marksmanship certification program for the Screen Actors Guild's Western region, a program that had evaluated several hundred working actors on firearms handling and kept complete records of every session it conducted. He had come to the club that morning for his own practice and had been watching from near the scoring table for the past 15 minutes. He stopped beside Walt and looked at Dean. "Didn't place you without the hat," Aldrich said. He turned to Clint. "Do you know who you've been talking to?" Clint said nothing. "I ran the SAG firearms program for over a decade," Aldrich said. "I have records on most working actors in this town who handle guns on screen." He pointed at Dean's target. "That grouping at 50 yards with a factory revolver is not a good day. It is not beginner's luck." He looked at Clint. "You came here this morning and told this man, in front of everyone, that his work was smoke and mirrors. He didn't argue with you, he didn't explain himself. He walked to the line and showed you." The crowd had the specific quiet of people who have just heard an authority speak clearly and are waiting to see what the challenged party does next. Clint held the silence. Then he turned to face Dean, turned all the way, fully, and the crowd watched him do it. "What I said at the Formosa," Clint said, "about Rio Bravo." He stopped. He looked at the 3-inch grouping on the bench. "I was wrong." He said it again, with more weight behind it. "That's better shooting than I did today. Better than I could do on my best day with that equipment." The crowd breathed. Dean picked up his revolver and laid it into its foam with the same care he always gave it. Then he said 4 words. "You'll get there." No performance in it, no generosity on display. The flat, quiet certainty of a man who has watched another man shoot and has assessed what is there. The real ability, the serious hours already behind it, and has reported the assessment accurately. Clint looked at him. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite a laugh. Something in the territory of a man who was braced for diminishment and received instead a piece of honest instruction delivered without ceremony. He glanced at Dutch. Dutch had found something interesting in the middle distance. He looked at Sal. Sal was examining his shoes with great concentration. Clint looked back at Dean. "That stance," he said. "Harlan taught you that." "He did." "Is it teachable?" Dean closed the latches on his case. He considered Clint for a moment, a small pause, the calculation of a man who does not use words without deciding to. Then, "Find Harlan. Tell him I sent you. He's in Burbank on Tuesdays." Clint nodded once. The clean, single nod that meant, received, retained, will act on. He extended his hand. Dean looked at the hand. Then he took it. Once, firmly. Carol Briggs started a slow clap from the back of the crowd that a handful of people joined, and then more. Walt wrote something in his clipboard. Dutch picked up his gear without a word and started toward the lot. Sal followed him in the same silence, which was, all things considered, the most graceful exit available to them. Aldrich caught Dean at the edge of the parking lot. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Send him to Harlan. After what he said about you." Dean put his case in the car. "He's going to keep making westerns," Dean said. "Might as well make them properly." He drove home through the San Fernando Valley in the October light, the dry hills brown on both sides of the road. He did not think about Clint Eastwood or the scores on the bench, or what 30 people had witnessed on a Saturday morning. He thought about what he was making for dinner. That was the whole of it. Look at where both men went from there. Because the afternoon that started with a score on a bench didn't end when they left the parking lot. It had been running, quietly, for years afterward. Clint Eastwood found Roy Harlan in November 1960. He drove to the Burbank range with his own revolver, the case he'd brought to Chatsworth, and the specific information that he needed to start over. Harlan was a small man with very precise hands and the professional economy of someone who has been teaching the same real thing for a long time and has run out of patience for approximations. He looked at Clint's stance. He said, "We'll start from the beginning." Clint started from the beginning. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. He trained through the rest of 1960 and into 1961 and the year after that. Not because Rawhide required it, because the arithmetic on that October bench had been specific, and he was not a man who ignored specific arithmetic. In late 1963, his CBS contract expired. Sergio Leone hired him for a Western filming in Spain. Leone mentioned to his cinematographer, after the first week of principal photography, that Eastwood's relationship with a firearm was unlike any American actor he had worked with. Not the performance of the relationship itself, a genuine familiarity that the camera could see without being asked to manufacture it. Leone attributed it to Rawhide. He was partially right. The other part had been driving to Burbank on Tuesdays, because a man at a shooting range in the San Fernando Valley had told him to go and had sent a name ahead of him. Word of the Saturday at Chatsworth moved through the industry the way these things move. Not in the trades, not in the papers, but in green rooms and at parties and at the Formosa over drinks. The story gained details it hadn't had, and lost a few it did have, the way stories do in transit. In some versions, Clint had asked for the instruction publicly. In others, Dean had refused the handshake. Neither was true. The core of it stayed accurate. Dean Martin had shot a perfect score at 50 yards on a factory revolver, in front of 30 witnesses, on a Saturday morning when he had come to confirm to himself that the work was real. Wait, because that last part is the part that got left out of every version of the story. Not the score, not the crowd, the reason Dean was there in the first place. Dean never mentioned Chatsworth in any interview. Not once. He mentioned Rio Bravo many times, the picture, Howard Hawks, the music, John Wayne. Never the range, never Harlan, never the Saturday. Some things a man keeps not because they are secret, but because they are complete. And complete things do not need the public record added to them. Walt kept both targets for a while. Not mounted, not framed, folded in the bottom drawer of the range office desk, under the spare clipboard. They stayed there until Walt retired in 1971, and the desk was cleared. Nobody knew what they were or why they mattered, so they were thrown away with everything else. 50 yards, 3 inches, 6 shots. The 30-odd people who were at Chatsworth Valley Shooting Club on that Saturday in October 1960 knew what they had seen. They told it the way people tell things that belong to them. Carefully, to the right person, in the right room. The details changed in transit. The number never did. 60 out of 60. That number held. Some scores live in the people who witness them, and those people carry them for the rest of their lives. And that is a more permanent archive than any clipboard notation, or trade item, or press release. They told it until they didn't have anyone left to tell it to. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think.